Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum. And today we have Operation Moonglow, the history of Project Apollo, an interesting history, not the kind of history you would expect. And we have Teasel Muir-Harmony, the author, with us today, directly from the East Coast, I assume. We're here to talk about what went into Project Apollo, how it got started. But before we do that, I'd like to see how you got started. You have a very interesting story about how you came across a file and that started, and how many years ago that was for this project.
It was far too many years ago for me to really admit, but I was at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and going through documents for a different project that I was working on. And I decided that, I had a little extra time. I should try to get a better sense of the context of American scientific programs in Japan at that time. So, and that related to what I was working on. And going through boxes in State Department folders, I found documents describing this exhibit of John Glenn's spacecraft when it was on exhibit in Tokyo in 1962. And so John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth, and his spacecraft went around the world on this diplomatic tour. And reading this document in the archives was so surprising because the crowds were just enormous in size, hundreds of thousands of people in just a few days. And they waited in line for hours just to walk by this spacecraft. And it really struck me. So I went and spoke to some colleagues, some space historians, and they said that they were aware that the spacecraft had gone on exhibit, but no one had written about it. There wasn't much that they knew to the story. And so I just started diving deeper and deeper and found out that it was actually really central to the larger story of the American space program and why Kennedy proposed to go to the moon in the first place.
Well, it's very interesting, because of course you are young, and it didn't happen. You're a historian looking back on it, but at least part of our audience, including myself, we're young children or teenagers or whatever, watching this whole thing unfold, and it really was a tremendous enthusiastic burst. And since I was a teenager at the time, and I was always thinking about, and it was during the Vietnam War, which we'll talk about a little bit later. I was always thinking about how can we divert attention from that kind of competition in war to a different kind of competition, and couldn't space take that place? So there were a lot of people thinking the same kind of thoughts, and that's why it made it really, really crucial to watch. So in all of your files, you didn't ever figure out which Hollywood studio filmed the moon shot, right?
No evidence of that so far.
Good. Okay, so let's go back to the 1950s when this was getting started. And Eisenhower is president, and Eisenhower, having been the major, for those who aren't aware, was the major military general leading the World War II against all the Allies, against the Germans, and then became president 7 or 8 years later in the early 50s during the Korean War. So we had this ex-general, knew all about military expenditures and stuff like that, and just thought that this would be a waste of money, right? I mean, that the going to space, putting a man on the moon, it would cost billions and billions of dollars for no reason whatsoever, sort of.
Exactly. So just as Eisenhower's about to leave office, he gets these reports, these estimates for how much it would cost to send humans to the moon. And so this is 60 years ago, just around this time, this transition from the Eisenhower to the Kennedy administrations. But Eisenhower gets this estimate that it's going to be, I think they thought between $30 and $50 billion. So more than it ended up actually costing. But he he was horrified by that. He's very fiscally conservative, and he made some comment how he was not going to hawk his jewels at the moon, which was a reference to the funding of Columbus with Ferdinand and Isabella. And he thought it was just going to be too wasteful in spending and just not worth that price. But he did think that space was important in general, especially when it came to national security. But human spaceflight and sending humans to the moon just seemed like a folly to him.
And it was interesting. You to go back a couple of years earlier than that. You have stories about how the Democrats started to maneuver in order to try to obviously win the next election against the Republicans. And one of the ideas they had was the missile gap. And the other one was that the Russians with Sputnik were getting ahead of us technologically. So I want to tell a little bit about, and Lyndon Johnson, who eventually became president, but was the Senate majority leader at the time, played a big kind of, behind the scenes, real political type maneuvering role. So why don't you tell us that story? Because I think that's very interesting, because Kennedy and Johnson both played this game in a slightly different way. And Kennedy ended up beating Johnson for the election, but then made Johnson his vice president. And then those two were both the ones that ended up running the space program.
So exactly. So Johnson, I think, is probably the most uncredited person when it comes to the early years of space exploration in the United States, and he was really critical early on in the foundation of NASA, as well as then the decision to send humans to the moon during the Kennedy administration. But when Sputnik was launched, this was October of 1957. Johnson saw this as a perfect opportunity to advance his party's political interests. So he thought this is going to be a great way to criticize the Eisenhower administration. And the Eisenhower administration had approached national security with trying to be fiscally conservative, to limit the amount of investment in the military and instead invest at home. His idea was the Cold War is going to last a very long time. And so what we need to do is invest in our economy. And that's going to be the best approach to fighting the Cold War in the long run. So this Sputnik was a moment because of the association of the satellite with larger missile technology and the potential of the Soviet Union to launch an ICBM at the United States. So this was part of the fear and the association. And so it provided the perfect opportunity for the Democrats to criticize the Republicans and criticize the Eisenhower administration and say, you didn't prepare us, you weren't investing enough in missile development or in satellites, and we're behind the Soviet Union. And Johnson, in particular, thought it would be a great thing to lead with. And this was a moment when the Democrats were really split when it came to civil rights, the Southern Democrats and Democrats in other parts of the country. And so space was going to be their issue. Johnson just led the charge. He made it very public. The critique, he really thought this was going to be not only great for his party, but also great for the chance of being elected president in 1960. That was his hope, at least. And he was great with using rhetoric and comparing it to a Pearl Harbor or the Alamo. And part of the way we think about Sputnik as a shock comes from some of the ways that the theatrics of Johnson.
Yeah, that was a nice element of your book to explain how some of the things that we take as if they were endemic to what actually happened were actually PR operations by somebody or another. That it really was a spin on what happened in order to try to get their way politically one way or another. I found that fascinating because, as I said, I was young and I took it all in straight as if science was driving the whole thing.
It is one of those, the way we remember the story or the way that it was retold many times, I think makes it surprising when you go into some of the details, especially that both the Soviet Union and the United States had announced publicly that they were going to launch satellites during this period of time. There's this large international cooperative program or project called the International Geophysical Year, and this is countries around the world came together to study the Earth between 1957 and 1958. And the announcements that both the Soviet Union and the United States would launch satellites as part of this effort was made years ahead of time. And so it was public knowledge that it was going to happen within this relative time frame. And the use of those satellites for atmospheric studies in particular. But it wasn't quite a shock to anyone who was following that news and following the fact that that was going to happen. And it really got amplified quite amazingly over the course of a number of weeks following the launch.
Yeah, and what's interesting but not surprising is that both sides were lying a lot about what their current situation was technologically. Both exaggerated what they could do and already could do, et cetera. So. And Khrushchev, and you go into the politics inside the Soviet Union too, that Khrushchev was trying hard to hold on to power. And so some of the things he did were, and the lies, exaggerations, were an attempt to try to keep his position in power in the Soviet Union, right? So, interesting.
Yeah, and the dynamics, as you mentioned, with all these political leaders were really tied to domestic politics as well as international politics, and these two things intersected and affected each other in great ways. So within the United States, it was with this eye to especially the next presidential election, and then within the Soviet Union, Khrushchev saw it as an important way to just hold on to power there.
It's very interesting because it's like the Soviet Union, the communist organization of politics, and the democratic organization of politics, but the politicians in both places behaved exactly the same. It's like,
well, one thing that
is there some political system where the politicians don't show up? I don't know.
One thing that I find somewhat funny about the space race is both the United States and the Soviet Union look to spaceflight to demonstrate the values of each respective superpower and the strength of their political system, but they were trying to differentiate between each other with the same tools, so with the same types of demonstrations. So they were both sending humans into space to prove communism is better than capitalism or vice versa.
Another part of the detail that you talk about was the PR effort on both sides. And there was a lot of PR done that we would never do now after World War II to win the hearts and minds, as they used to say, of the Europeans or then later the Africans. And we did it in a way which we would never do now, which is we supplied a lot of books of our best writers to a lot of libraries throughout Europe so that people could read our best writers. And there was a little contest between the French and the British and the Americans as to whose writers were more often read in the libraries of other places. I just, and the amount of effort that went into it. You talk a lot about the USIA background. Well, we'll go into that a little bit later, of the PR problems and the PR army that was employed in order to make the moon landing what it was. It didn't just generate all that interest itself. That was another fascinating.
Yeah. And thanks. Well, it's an important part of this story is the priority given to what today we call soft power. And you can see it runs consistently. There's a thread through the Eisenhower administration and into the Kennedy administration, Johnson administration, and even Nixon to an extent. And it's something that has received less sort of a priority, I would say, more recently. But during that period of time, during the 50s and the 60s, it was seen as essential to American power, the United States' role in the world, national security interests. And so each of those administrations invested heavily in public relations, public diplomacy, and had really, really extensive programs relating to promoting the United States abroad.
We'll get back to the history. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because this thing about the PR is so crucial. There's one little story you tell about whether or not we should plant an American flag on the moon when we land on the moon the first time. And I thought it was fascinating that all of the different advisors went back and forth on exactly what wording should be used and everything to try to make this a universal experience, that it's being accomplished by all of humanity. and that no way would we ever put an American flag on and try to brand it and so on and so forth. And in the end, some senator said, "No way, we spent all that money. You got to do it."
It was heavily debated, this question, should we plant an American flag on the moon? And part of what was controversial about it is when you plant a flag somewhere, it suggests territorial possession. And the Outer Space Treaty from 1967 said no one can claim sovereignty of the moon. And there was a lot of concern that planting a flag would suggest that. And especially in this post-colonial moment, the United States, well, at least the State Department and U.S. Information Agency did not want people in other countries to perceive the United States as a sort of a new form of empire. So there was a lot of debate, and as you mentioned, there were other suggestions. There was some suggestions that you could plant a UN flag on the moon, or the USIA suggested that you could even bring up soil from Earth and scatter it around the moon from soil from every continent. So they had a lot of different ideas for what they could do instead. But basically, there was a lot of concern among members of Congress, and then also people wrote into Congress saying, American taxpayers paid for this lunar landing, and so we should have our flag. And they actually it used it as a way to, or the Congress used the authorization bill and the budget, NASA's budget for the next year to sort of influence the decision. And so as soon as NASA announced that they were going to plant an American flag on the moon on the first lunar landing mission, then they got their appropriations. So, and it was written into that the United States, if they landed on another celestial body, had to plant an American flag in the moon. So it is a sort of a funny story, and it really reveals a lot of sort of the debates around sort of the meaning and significance of the moon landing and who that mission belonged to, how it was both American but also global.
The power of the purse, as they say. We're paying for this. You have to do what we say. But they also did, and we'll go back into that later. They also did a lot of things very well in terms of paying attention to the psychology of it and how it should be done. And that also is something that sounds anachronistic at this point. That we barely use the State Department or the diplomats at all, much less all this attempt at making sure the wording is proper and that the people can feel that this was an accomplishment by everybody. And the work that they did, to say, well, the Soviet Union has done this, and this country's scientist, Tesla, has done this, that contributed to it. Pointing those things out, it's just simple. It's simple politics, but it's ignored so often.
And I love looking at how that approach to public diplomacy evolved over the 1960s, but it was seen as really essential by every administration. And Kennedy was hands-on, and Johnson was hands-on with this, and so was Nixon and Kissinger. They really saw this as part of their administration's priorities, and they saw public diplomacy and the role of the State Department and the U.S. Information Agency as really, really important arms of American diplomacy.
So let's go back to the late 1950s. Sputnik is up, and then the Americans launch a satellite later, and then they try to focus on the fact that theirs is more scientific and more open, and we talk about it. So there's a little differentiation, but still in second place. And then the Soviet Union launches a man into space, Yuri Gagarin. So they are the first man in space. So the U.S. is behind on two big things. And they decide, so Kennedy's now president, he decides we've lost the first two big things, what can we do to catch up?
Exactly. And I'll actually just rewind a little bit to when Kennedy first became president, because it's almost exactly 60 years ago. And it's sort of it's fun to think of the anniversary in this moment right now that we're going through as a country. And Kennedy was briefed on the potential future of NASA, he also received a report on a potential lunar exploration mission, much like Eisenhower. And much like Eisenhower, he also thought it was too expensive. And his science advisor actually told him, maybe you should even consider canceling the Mercury program. And this was the first American human spaceflight program that would just send one astronaut at a time, either on a suborbital or orbital mission. And they hadn't had a flight yet, but he was really discouraged from pursuing human spaceflight. And this was January 1961. Okay, so that's the context of that. Mm-hmm. And then things changed really, really quickly with Gagarin's flight, and then a week later with the Bay of Pigs invasion. Mm-hmm. This is a failed invasion of Cuba, and it was backed by the CIA. It was seen as a huge blow to U.S. prestige and really sort of shook things up. So that combination of those two humiliating defeats on the world stage for this new president, he asked his advisors to find a space program that promises dramatic results that we can win, and that really makes it very clear what his motivation was, which the drama of space was important, and being able to beat the Soviet Union was important. And at first, Kennedy, he was hoping that the U.S. could beat the Soviet Union in these kinds of symbolic activities related to science and technology, and in some other field that might be a bit more directly applicable to issues on Earth. And so he even suggested something like the desalination of water. He thought that'd be more useful, but it became clear it was going to be space. And so Johnson led the charge, and he spoke to many people, many experts in the field, and they came back with this goal of sending humans to the moon and returning them safely back to Earth.
Yeah, we think of it as just U.S. science marching on, but it really was, that we were in a football game and we were 2 touchdowns down, and they had to figure out their Hail Mary pass, and it was, let's go put a man on the moon. And it's really, really quite an amazing shift in thinking. So, yeah, go ahead.
It is, and especially when you take into consideration just how bold Kennedy's proposal was. So there was the first American spaceflight, which happened on May 5th, 1961 with Alan Shepard, a brief 15-minute suborbital flight. And that was the extent of experience in human spaceflight before Kennedy proposed Apollo. And Apollo at that time was estimated, and it turned out to be correct, about $25 billion at the time. This was just an extraordinary expenditure. By the mid-1960s, this was over 4% of the federal budget. To put that into context, today and for many decades, NASA gets about 0.5% of the federal budget. So it's just the scale of it was immense. It was much greater than the Panama Canal or Manhattan Project. So it was bold both in the idea of what we're going to achieve, but then also the investment as well. But Kennedy saw it as really essential, and essential along what he said was the fluid lines of the Cold War. And a lot of it had to do with what was going to win hearts and minds, and this larger context of not just a competition with the Soviet Union, but this idea that a big part of that competition was winning alignment with the alignment of other countries around the world. And so this is a moment when many nations were emerging, becoming independent. There was the post-colonial movement, and this was a moment that Kennedy thought spaceflight was going to be essential for the U.S.'s ability to step in to guide those countries to win that alignment and to ultimately further the United States' position internationally.
Yeah. So he moved ahead. And we had the big flight that he watched. I think we have a picture for them. Arnav, if we can put the picture up on the screen, maybe. Yeah, the first picture with Kennedy. Yeah, that one. If that's up on the screen, that'd be great. So you can see the White House, and it's interesting that Jackie is there along with JFK and Vice President Johnson at the time.
Mm-hmm. They called Kennedy out of a National Security Council meeting, and and they all crowded around in his secretary's office to watch on this small television. And they breathed a sigh of relief, because if this flight had not been successful, it really would have called everything into question about what the next steps were going to be.
Mm-hmm. All right. So Gemini, for those who aren't familiar with it, was one of the earlier stages of which led up to the Apollo portion of it. And Gemini was an attempt to see how people can do in space, right? Maybe tell a little bit about the project, how many liftoffs there were. I mean, people are used to now at one every 5 or 10 years. This was quite a different speed.
Oh yeah, it would have been a really exciting time to be following space flight. So we had Project Mercury, which was the first American human spaceflight program, sending one person into space at a time, and first suborbital, then became orbital. But we had to learn a whole lot more to send humans to the moon, and Project Gemini helped us do that. So this was 2 astronauts for every mission. There were 10 missions over the course of 2 years. And what they needed to do is they needed to develop certain capabilities, and they also had to do a number of tests, especially biomedical tests on the astronauts, psychological tests also for, how are people going to handle long duration space flight or longer duration up to 2 weeks. And so they learned a lot about spacewalks and rendezvous and docking and just preparing all the skills necessary for going to the moon. A big part of that was tied to the approach that was taken to going to the moon, lunar orbit rendezvous, which required rendezvous and docking and building up these skills.
Why don't you tell everyone what the technology is? There's these rockets, and then there's a capsule, and there's another piece of it, and they got to come up and down. And it was complicated. So why don't you give an idea about why they were testing everything and not just zipping there and coming back again?
Yeah. So if we were just going to zip there and come back, you need a really, really big rocket, and it would have been very difficult to build that in time, and it would have been a huge challenge. And so there was this ingenious idea that was developed instead, Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, which uses a multi-stage rocket and a multi-stage spacecraft to achieve the lunar landing goal. And that saves on fuel and development costs, all sorts of things. So what it entails is the Saturn V rocket, which is a multi-stage rocket, huge, larger than the Statue of Liberty, 363 feet tall, extraordinarily powerful. And on the top of that, there was a multi-stage spacecraft. So that would launch from the Earth. And the first stage would fall away, and then the next stage would fall away. And then the next stage would put the astronauts into Earth orbit for a bit. And then it would reignite and then send them to the moon. Now, once they got to the moon, they would start orbiting the moon, and the lunar module would separate from the command and service module. So this multi-part spacecraft, and the lunar module would land on the moon, while the command and service module would continue orbiting the moon. And the astronauts would get out of the lunar module, walk around, get back in. The top half of that lunar module then would join the command module orbiting the moon, and then they would return back to Earth in the command module. Hopefully that was a clear enough summary.
That was a great explanation. Yes.
I should have the models with me so I can show the different steps.
Well, I think one thing that's helpful maybe is a little bit of percentages here. So we have this rocket with all the fuel in it. It launches. There's this tiny little spaceship on the top of it. Relatively the size of the spaceship compared to the rocket that launches it is 2 or 3% or something like that, right? 4 or 5%, something like that. Okay.
Something like that. Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Okay, so but the fuel, so the majority of the fuel is used to get them in orbit. Mm-hmm. So they use gravity in order to get off, but they must need some fuel for adjusting and all that kind of stuff. And I know that in the story of the actual landing, they were getting close to not having enough fuel to both land and take off again. So because it's such a small space, obviously can't have that much fuel on board. So it didn't seem like it took that much fuel to leave the module going around the moon to go down to the moon and come back up again. Do you have any ideas that like 1% of the total amount of fuel, or is it?
Oh, in comparison to from
just getting
Earth?
into orbit, yeah.
I don't have the comparisons. One of the things that's important to know about the lunar module is it was designed to be extraordinarily light, and they really had to get down the weight as much as possible. And one of the things that they did to do that is they actually took out the seats from that spacecraft, and that not only allowed them to reduce the weight of the seats, but it allowed them to make the windows much smaller. And if you can think about when you're sitting down in a car, you need a big windshield. But if you were standing up right against it, you would only need a small one to look through. And the weight of the glass was a significant amount of the, contributed to the weight of the spacecraft. So that was one of the things that they did to reduce the weight. So the lunar module is quite light. And then also an important note there is that the moon has 1/6 of the Earth's gravity. And that makes a really big difference. It's much easier to launch something from the moon versus the Earth.
Well, when I read this thing about the fact that they took the seats out and they had to stand, I got this, I worked in New York a long time. I got the impression of people on the subway standing, waiting to land on the moon. It's like, it's undignified, but that's the way that they went down they stood the whole way down. That's really quite interesting. I thought it was, I had never heard that before.
So, unfortunately, it wasn't too long of a trip, and it worked out well. And because of the moon has less gravity, landing on it wouldn't have the same effect as landing on Earth.
Right. So Armstrong actually landed it very softly. Even though it was easy, he even did an amazing job of landing it softly. Right. They said it really didn't sink in very much.
He was an incredible pilot and did a very, very good job under a very stressful circumstance. So not only this is the first lunar landing, not only is it the first lunar landing, the whole world is watching. The landing site that was chosen had some boulders in it, and so he had to take over manual control to find a different landing site. And it was really coming down to the wire. And there were also alarms. There was concern. There were these 2 alarms that went off, and basically they were saying that the computer was being overloaded, and it was going to be fine. But there was a question of whether or not it wouldn't be fine until they figured out what those alarms meant. And so he, under huge pressure, under very little fuel left, was able to land the spacecraft very, very gently. And
he had been in one of the earlier Gemini flights, right? One of the important ones. And had contributed to a PR campaign afterwards. And you hinted that he was partially picked to be the first one to to walk on the moon because he was so good at the PR after the Gemini one. That was one of the qualifications.
Exactly. So Armstrong was really quite talented when it came to diplomacy. It came naturally to him, and then he also put in some effort too. So in the 1960s, he went on this tour of South America, and in addition to getting the briefings, some background about where he was going, he took the effort to learn Spanish, and he read about the history of the different places and decided to incorporate that history into his speeches and put a lot of work in figuring out how to connect what he was doing in space with people that he met with. And it resonated with people. And his biographer has suggested that was part of what led to the decision to give him the opportunity to be the first person to walk on the moon.
It was, again, another insight into the whole game with the astronauts, that there might have been a lot of politics involved inside the choices and why the choices were made and who gets to do which one thing, which is perfectly understandable, but nobody, because every human institution operates that way. But when you think about the space program, you think that would never happen. So.
Yeah, there were. I could go into it. I fear it would be probably more information than anyone would want about how Armstrong got that role, and some of the, well, I wouldn't say controversy, but there was some frustration. I think it was difficult for Buzz Aldrin, his crewmate, who didn't get that opportunity. He was the second person, and But Armstrong had demonstrated just incredible abilities and cool-headedness and talents when it came to diplomacy during the Gemini program, and so he was a great choice. They had also considered Frank Borman, who was the commander of the Apollo 8 mission. That was the first lunar orbital mission. And Borman was also really astute when it came to diplomacy. He really saw his role as an astronaut as contributing national service to the United States within the midst of the Cold War. And he said he hadn't become an astronaut for science or exploration, but really service to his nation in the same way that you would if you were serving in the military.
And part of the service of the nation that he was interested in was to try to improve our image with other countries, and took it seriously as to how to do that presentation, not just. This was a time, there was a novel, I think, in the late 50s called The Ugly American, which was then a very popular statement, which was about, businessmen going abroad and behaving badly and giving a bad name to everybody in America. So to counteract all that, and of course, there was all the bad press from the Vietnam War as well. Another thing that was interesting in your book was how early the international bad press against the Vietnam War was. You had the statistics, which I found fascinating, that USIA did to decide who were more popular, the cosmonauts or the astronauts, and they did it. They did it in Morocco and Nigeria, and the numbers were very interesting. So why don't you tell about that? They did this to try to see what they should do about the situation. They took a poll, and what did the poll show them?
The poll showed them that cosmonauts were far more popular, and what they said is both north and south of the Sahara, and this was the case for a while, and I think in large part because initially the United States did not send the astronauts on these diplomatic tours. They sent spacecraft, and they did other types of promotional events, exhibits, and distribution of pamphlets and books and all sorts of other things, films, but they weren't sending the astronauts abroad. And this changed in the mid 1960s, and they started sending astronauts on these diplomatic tours. And I think that really raised the profile, not only of the program, but the individual astronauts themselves, and affected that public opinion polling. But I think it's also worth noting that the Eisenhower administration and Kennedy administration, in particular, really interested in public opinion, international public opinion, and invested quite a lot in polling data. And Kennedy wanted the raw data all the time. He really was so curious about what international public opinion was, and what it would tell him about how the United States should be conducting itself in the world. Public opinion polls about space exploration were part of this, but this was part of something much, much larger in terms of this idea that the United States should be investing in international public polling, and then that should inform our foreign policies. And you see that especially strongly with Kennedy. So he did these worldwide polling, and one thing that was somewhat clever about it, they would never directly have an American conducting the questionnaire. They would hire local polling firms and try to make sure that there was no clear information that this poll was going to be used by the United States government. So they went to efforts to try to make this relatively neutral. I think probably most people thought, this poll is either coming from the Soviet Union or the United States. But perhaps it was less clear, which country it was serving.
Well, the one in Nigeria, you said, I think it was 75% favored the cosmonauts over the astronauts. The astronauts only had 7% or something. It was really different. And you point out that problem came from the civil rights issues that were going on in the 60s in the United States, the very visible problem, race problem that we have in our country, and that really, really hurt us. In fact, that we didn't look as good as South Africa did to some countries in Africa, which was an amazing insight into what was going on then, and also why the politics back home put more attention onto the civil rights issues.
Yes, and I think that that point about South Africa came as quite a surprise to some of the diplomats at that time. I mean, like they couldn't believe it. But many of the reports going back from the embassies were saying, there's only so much we can do given what's going on in the United States when it comes to civil rights issues and the Vietnam War. And this is one of the lessons, or this is sort of one of the important elements of soft power, is that it's really limited by sort of the entire image of a country. And just because space exploration might be interesting and might capture the attention of people, it can't wipe away the fact that there were civil rights injustices and injustices also in the Vietnam War. And there was a lot of critique for that internationally. And civil rights especially resonated with people in Africa and caused a lot of people to question, what should our relationship to the United States be, and how can the United States be selling its society as a model nation? Like, why should we pursue a political system and a social system in line with the United States when there are so many injustices in that country? And so that was part of the message that was being sent back to Washington, D.C., saying that, we can only do so much with the space program. There are these other issues. You can't chrome plate over them. And this is one of the limitations of soft power today and in general. But there was increased investment in these space public diplomacy programs with an effort to counteract that. But that was a challenge that the United States was up against. And I think also part of the reason why the first lunar landing, I think it affected the impact of the first lunar landing as well, or perhaps even the interest in carry on or the additional missions after the first mission.
It's interesting too that the politicians back in the United States seem to listen to all this feedback because the PR campaign and the preparations for using the lunar landing, even though they were for political uses, did by the idea that we had to make it as inclusive as possible, that this is something that humanity is achieving, not just Americans. And several other, what you'd say, a very enlightened way of looking at what we're contributing to the world versus, say, American exceptionalism, which we are always focusing on, so often in our history. It was saying like, yes, but we're doing this with the history of all the science which was done in your country, and everybody has contributed to this. I found that fascinating that they were listening. So why don't we take a look at some of the overwhelming response to, there were two big PR campaigns, Apollo 8 and Apollo 11, Apollo 11 being even bigger, but Apollo 8 was when they first went and orbited the moon and then came back again. And then that was only 6 months later was Apollo 11, and they had two other missions in between to test out moonwalking and so on. I mean, walking in space and so on. So not too far apart in that time. So why don't we show some of those pictures across the world and the reaction?
Yeah, this is from the Friendship 7 tour in 1962. This was a very, very brand new thing for people to see a spacecraft. It was just from the realm of science fiction almost. So you can get a better sense for why people were so eager to check it out when it visited their city.
And the next picture.
So this is an example of some of the exhibits that the U.S. Information Agency set up during the 1960s. You can see in the caption there, West Pakistan and Guatemala and Nigeria. There's an extensive number of these types of exhibits and film screenings and the distribution of pamphlets and working with local press as well to make sure all the missions were covered, working with local TV stations to make sure that they were also covering American space achievements. I'll note that the United States put extra effort into promoting its space program in countries where it had tracking stations, and Nigeria was one of those. And you can see that image in Nigeria. They made a point of having lots of exhibits and lots of material related to the space program in those countries to ensure that they would be welcoming to the United States tracking program.
some of the decisions made as to where to go and where not to go, and when to go and in which order and everything sounded like the seating plan at a dinner at the White House or something like that with a bunch of diplomats. It's very the most important decisions are where people got seated and how they felt compared to the people around them. So quite interesting that that's taking place on the whole global scale. So next picture. Yeah.
So here's an example of the astronauts traveling internationally, and this was a tour that traveled to both Greece and Turkey, as well as a number of African nations. And this is them in Ethiopia, showing some details of a Gemini helmet.
And the next picture.
And so this is similar. It's part of the preparation for the first moon landing. And so the U.S. Information Agency and U.S. government more generally knew this was going to be one of the biggest events of the century, and it would be even bigger if they promoted it. And so they put a lot of work into getting people excited about the first lunar landing before it happened in July of 1969. And this included sending a spacecraft around Europe. You can see it there. And it's I believe this is the Apollo 8 command module, and then exhibits, an extensive array of exhibits and television programs. They even trained journalists from other countries. They brought them to the United States and had them meet with NASA personnel and to learn about the American space program firsthand, so that they could bring that knowledge back to their respective countries when they were covering the mission. They had souvenirs and all sorts of things, handouts. They did. It's just it's hard to even sum it up, just because the scale of this public relations endeavor was unprecedented and just extremely well thought through, quite expensive, and sort of extensive programming in each country around the world.
What you said is well thought through. They would. One of the things I found interesting in your book was they picked out the popular broadcasters in different countries and then made them, somehow pulled them into it and then brought them to NASA and Houston, showed them around, all that kind of thing, so that they would be the spokesman for the next 5 or 6 years in that country, and their popularity would wear off on America.
Exactly. And that was an important part of the approach, was to get people in other countries involved and make them participants in a way. And so I spoke to one of them, Eric Tamberg, who was the Norwegian Walter Cronkite is the way I first learned about him. But he was the space broadcaster. And he told me about traveling throughout the United States, multiple NASA centers, to learn about the space program and the connections that he made there. And then he continued to be an important person when it came to spaceflight within Norway, and explaining what was going on with NASA throughout the decades. But they also had another program called the Space Mobile program, and this was a much smaller scale kind of endeavor, where they had it was like a library on wheels, except focused on space, and they would train local lecturers often. And so they saw it important that they'd have American space lecturers training local space lecturers, who could then connect with their communities, but also then continue this message of, American accomplishments in spaceflight.
All right, the next picture.
So this is from the Apollo 11 mission, the first lunar landing mission. And one thing that I love about this story is it really connects to these larger efforts to make the first moon landing a global event, and it's very illustrative of the symbolism, the intentional symbolism, to make this moon landing very, very inclusive. And so this is the mission emblem from Apollo 11. These were designed by the crew, every mission emblem, and sometimes they would get help and feedback. But this one was done by Mike Collins, the command module pilot. Some of the important symbolism there, they decided not to put their names on it, and other patches have the astronauts' names. They wanted this to be inclusive. They also decided to write Apollo 11 like that, as opposed to spelling out the word 11, because they didn't want it to be in English. They wanted people who spoke any language to know what it was and to be able to interpret it. And there's also symbolism of the olive branch, suggesting that this is a peaceful mission.
Next.
This is the audience following the flight in Korea. One of the things that the U.S. government did is they worked with local governments or groups to put up large screens outdoors. So this is at a time where there's a huge increase in television sets around the world, but not everyone had a television set at this time.
Right.
And then also some people wanted to watch this event in unison with a group of people. It was really the type of thing that people felt was a shared human experience, and not only the awareness that people around the world were following the flight, but like the sense that you get when you're in a big group of people doing something together. And so there were many of these large outdoor projectors and screens set up so that people could follow the flights in unison.
All right, next.
And this is another example of some of the intentional symbolism that went into the first lunar landing mission. This is the plaque that was left on the moon on the lunar module spacecraft, and it involved the input of many people: the White House, the State Department, the USIA, Library of Congress, the Smithsonian. It's very concise, but a lot of people had their hand in this, and in part because they wanted to clearly symbolize that this mission was for all humankind. So you see the depiction of the two hemispheres there on the Earth, but no political boundaries, and that was an important part of the symbolism. That this was not about politics. That we live on one Earth together was a lot of the messaging, and you can see that written in the text. The AD, I always find this funny, was seen as a clever way of sneaking God in.
Right. A little too clever.
Sort of less universalist, but then you still see Nixon's name on there. So that still signals that this is from the United States. But this was part of what was planned by their symbolic activities committee that was formed to ensure that there were symbolic activities undertaken during the first lunar landing that would signal that the first moon landing was for all humankind and not just an American endeavor. So this was one of many gestures that they planned for the mission.
One of the interesting small details in your book were the different characters that would contribute these words. Different, like William Safire, the writer, was a young man working, in the writing portion of the office at the time for Nixon, and also, that Nelson Rockefeller was behind the open skies policy of Eisenhower, and that was interesting to find out who it was that originated different parts of the program in their suggestions to the politicians that then moved on. So it's also nice to see that this was in color. Say right near the end of the 60s is when life switched over to being in color. So for those of you who weren't there then, that was almost as big a deal as when we landed on the moon. So the next picture.
So President Nixon called up the astronauts on the lunar surface, and he said it was the most historic phone call in history. And part of what I like about this element of the story is that he talks about how significant or why the mission is so significant, and he points to the fact that both the humans traveled farther than ever before, and they walked on the surface of another celestial body for the first time in human history. But he also mentions that more people came together to watch this event than any moment in history, and that this was a truly global event, and half the world's population stopped what they were doing to follow this mission, and over 500 million people watched it on their television sets, the largest audience ever around the globe. And so he referenced that and included it in the significance of the first lunar landing, that it wasn't just about the astronauts traveling to the moon. It was also about what was happening on Earth because of that mission. And there's sort of a fun related story. When the astronauts returned to Earth, Buzz Aldrin, I believe it was Buzz Aldrin, said to Neil Armstrong, after looking through all the coverage and watching some of the television coverage in the newspapers, he said it looked like they were having a party on Earth, and I think we missed the whole thing. But the idea is that the moon landing, yes, it did happen on the moon, and that's part of its significance of Apollo 11. But part of its significance is also what happened here on Earth.
Mhm. You have another fun story about when they were picking him up out of the sea after they landed, and Nixon's on a boat, and Nixon seemed to be behaving like a teenage boy in his excitement and everything like that. And one doesn't hear those things about Nixon too often, so I thought that was nice.
Yeah, he really appreciated the astronauts and would get very very excited about speaking with them, and he thought they were great representations of the country. But at that landing, he was showing off his binoculars, and it's a funny story. There's the kind of the commentary that was remembered about how it impacted him is
Personally,
sort of it's sort of a nice side of Nixon that you don't always see.
Yeah. So the next picture.
So this is another example of some of the people following the flight around the world, and there's some great stories about, where people were setting up TVs or how they were able to follow the flight together. Through shop windows sometimes, and gathered in restaurants or at a gas station in Norway, or reading the newspaper. In places where they didn't have live coverage, the United States made sure to get film clips to places as quickly as possible. Flew them in within a matter of hours so that they could be shown. So it was a lot of effort went into making sure that there would be these audiences following the flight around the world.
Well, it's an interesting part of the not the advent of television, but maybe its second or third decade, the way that it was used for these purposes. And I know in '73, I was studying in the Soviet Union, and I was right in Moscow at the Kremlin. And right across from the Kremlin is the big department store they call GUM. And they had set up in the windows there for everybody that was going to the Kremlin to see Lenin and so on and so forth in the mausoleum. They had a whole bunch of colored TVs, and on the colored TV was Nixon and Brezhnev, in California at his ranch, because it was the year of détente, and so they were projecting those images right back to the Kremlin and all around the world too. So it was you saw a big crowd would get outside the thing to watch the television, even though it was just Brezhnev and Nixon at his house having lunch or whatever. So this was much more exciting. So the next picture, one of the things, we'll go ahead. How this crowd is.
This is in Mexico City, and this is the Apollo 11 crew at the center there, and they're this motorcade through Mexico City. So after their flight, Nixon asked them to travel the world as his representatives, and to meet with foreign leaders, and to have these motorcades, public events, meet with scientists, all sorts of things. And so the astronauts over the course of 2 months went to over 20 countries, and they were just extraordinarily warmly welcomed. There was a lot of effort in the planning of the trip to make sure that they would be going to countries where they would be really warmly welcomed, because part of the motivation for this would be that this would be covered in newspapers, and it would displace headlines that had to do with the Vietnam War on the cover of newspapers, which would be good for the United States at that time. And I mean, there were a lot of benefits to this diplomatic tour. And one of the things that the astronaut said that I find really impactful is that they were quite surprised by the response, and they expected people to say, congratulations, you did it, you went to the moon, or you Americans went to the moon. But what they heard is that we did it. And this sentiment that it was something that we had done together as humans, and that people around the world felt like participants in that mission. And that was the thing that really impacted them during that diplomatic tour.
And that was an intentional setup by the U.S. government and USIA to try to make everybody feel that way. I thought that was an interesting part of it, because you can feel that way automatically, but you can also be moved to think that way. And there was a little bit of both. So there's a question that came in from the audience I'm going to ask before we go on, because it's relevant here. You see this picture. The astronauts are rock stars, dressed up in the local garb and so on and so forth. So the question was, most historians obviously don't get to speak to anybody that they're studying, but you were able to talk to some of the people who were involved in this process. And the question was, were you starstruck by any of the people that you got to talk to? Did they strike you as rock stars still, even though they were, world famous for what they did? That's the question.
Well, they are really incredibly talented people who have accomplished amazing things, and sometimes it can be intimidating to know where to start or how to have a conversation. But I've been really, really lucky in having the opportunity to speak to many of the Apollo astronauts. So I've got to speak to everyone from the Apollo 11 crew in this picture here, and some of them multiple times. Mike Collins has just been extraordinarily helpful in answering my questions and thinking through the topic. And as a curator at the Smithsonian, he was the director of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum when it opened in 1976, and so has an appreciation for the museum. And so I've got to have quite a bit of interaction with him since I've been at the Smithsonian. But it's been it's such a privilege to speak with all of them. I've also in this project had the opportunity to speak to other people who contributed to the program, which was also just a wonderful opportunity. The timing of this project happened just in time because now it's starting to be too late. But I got to speak to people who worked for the U.S. Information Agency and exhibit design, and the science advisor from the USIA, and then people internationally as well. An artist in Japan told me about his work that was related to the moon landing. And so it's been wonderful to speak with people and get their stories. And sometimes it can be a little intimidating, but the stories they have to share are so exciting that you can't let intimidation hold you back.
Well, you certainly didn't, because you brought all their stories alive. So another part of what happened was that some photographs of the Earth from a different point of view have become extremely famous. One from Apollo 8 and then one from Apollo 11, right? Or is that
exactly? Yes.
So, and Apollo 8 is the one that everyone knows as Earthrise, and the Apollo 11 is the one everyone knows as the blue marble, the where you have the whole disk. So there we go. That's it.
So 17, yeah. So this was the very last Apollo mission, the last time we went to the moon in December of 1972, and the astronauts were able to capture this extraordinary image.
Did they plan to do it so that they would be able to get the entire, it's like the full Earth, not the full moon, but the full Earth? You've got to be there at the right time to get that picture, but it wasn't really planned, was it?
I don't believe they scheduled the timing of the mission based on that, but it was an opportunity that the Earth was not in shadow at all, which was quite lucky, and it really resonated with people extraordinarily well. Some of the timing of the mission actually had to do with Nixon. Nixon didn't want an Apollo mission a potential disaster on Apollo mission to mess up his reelection chances, right. And so. This one got pushed till after the election.
Is this the one? Which was the one that was right at Christmas? Because that had a big hit with the Pope among other people. Was that 8, Apollo 8? That
was Apollo 8. Yes.
Yeah. And they did it at Christmas. Yeah.
Exactly. And they read an address from outer space. They read Genesis in their Christmas Eve address, and as a way to connect with as many people on the world as possible, and not do something that was just in reference to Christmas, but something a bit more broad, but also for the sort of the significance of that moment of being the first time humans traveled to the moon.
Right, and took a look back at the Earth. Yeah. So we have only a little bit of time left, but we have the questions done. But I think one of the things that was really valuable about your book was the PR, the diplomacy, the way that we did things and how effective it was. And why don't we use that method more often? Why is it that we keep forgetting that that's what works in the world? And I mean, it would seem like you could take some of those ideas and use it in our relationship with China, for example. So I know that this isn't your aim here with the book and everything, but if you could just say a little bit about, what that PR approach is. The focus of it, of course, was on inclusivity, but there were other focuses too, openness, and of course, focusing on openness contrasts our political system with closed systems. But our system is slightly closed too. So So it's pretty important to try to live up to the ideals we set out. But it's also important to say, from a totally practical point of view, this form of diplomacy, this kind of soft power, far more powerful. And you can't erase, as you said earlier, you can't go around doing exactly the opposite and tell everybody you're in favor of peace and harmony. I mean, that's what hurt the Soviet Union so much. Mm-hmm. But we could be a little bit closer to what we say.
It's true. And I think when you look at the current situation in spaceflight, there's I think a push and some interest in collaborating with China in the future. And there have been huge limitations up to this point that the United States cannot cooperate with China in space. But I know within the space community, there's some hope that that will be reversed, because it not only could help us when it comes to exploration and when it comes to science. They just returned some lunar samples, and it would be fantastic, for American scientists to be able to compare those samples with the material that we collected during Apollo. But it's also important as an arm of diplomacy and to bring nations together. And so that's something that perhaps will occur in the future. And I think that there's some hope. But when it comes to soft power and investing in something like Apollo, I think often we remember Apollo as being very, very expensive. It was bold, and there are many things we can talk about. And it was very expensive, but the entire cost of Apollo was equivalent to about 1 year in Vietnam by the late 1960s. When you think of it as a foreign relations program or a national security program, when you think about soft power in terms of national security, I think it puts it into an important context in terms of not only how effective it can be, but it can also be like a very positive, relatively affordable investment for a country. And it is essential that that aligns with the other broader image of the country and sort of the values that the country is trying to purport or demonstrate. But I think Apollo is a wonderful example of what can be achieved when something like soft power is prioritized as part of a national agenda.
Yes, and your book made that perfectly clear. I thought it was one of the great things to make clear in your book. And it doesn't always cost as much as Apollo. I mean, in 1996, China was sort of making noises about Taiwan having to unite with them and so on, because Hong Kong was about to, and Macau was about to. And in order to put them off that insistence, they were given the Beijing Olympics in 2008. And that was allowed, and there were a lot of people against it because they said, you shouldn't let a communist country do such a thing, and so on and so forth. But it certainly changed their behavior for the next 10 years leading up to 2008. And although that wasn't an expensive decision, it was just using your soft power more intelligently about the situation. So I'm sure you and I hope that people will in the State Department, well, not just in the State Department because they've been ignored for so long recently, but in other places, realize the power that American culture still has, in spite of the fact that we've made lots and lots of mistakes, and we have our own civil rights issues that cause problems. But we still can do this, use these openness. We're all working together to help lead towards a, I mean, we're going to get to a human civilization on this planet sometime in the next 2 or 3 centuries. It'd be useful to do it slightly intelligently on the way there. So thank you very much for making your contribution towards that. And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in its 118th year of enlightened discussion. Thank you very much for joining us, Teasel.
Thank you so much for having me.